The ad was a tiny, smudged rectangle of ink, almost an afterthought in the classified section of the Crestfall Valley Chronicle, a paper whose circulation was probably limited to a few dozen old-timers and the local diner. It was wedged between a desperate plea for the return of a lost cat named Patches and an announcement for a bake sale at the Lutheran church. Night security officer needed, it read, the font stark and utilitarian. Blackwood Creek property. Secluded location. Competitive pay. No experience necessary. Each phrase was a hook, sinking deeper into the soft flesh of my desperation. My life, for the past 6 months, had been a slow-motion car crash. The factory where I'd worked for 5 years, stamping sheet metal into car doors, a job that promised pensions and stability, had shuttered its doors with less than a week's notice, citing foreign competition. My severance package was a joke, eaten up by 2 months of rent. My savings account, once a source of modest pride, was now a barren wasteland. My landlord, Mr. Gable, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, had started leaving polite but firm notes taped to my door, each one a little less polite than the last. The "no experience necessary" was the final, irresistible lure. It was a phrase that spoke my language, the language of a man with nothing left to offer but his time and his willingness to endure. I called the number. A voice on the other end answered with a single, gravelly word. Henderson. There was no greeting, no company name, just a surname that sounded like it had been scraped over rocks. I told him I was calling about the job. He grunted, a sound of profound indifference. You got a car that runs? He asked. I looked out the window at my 15-year-old sedan, a symphony of rust and sputtering promises. Yes, I lied. It's reliable. He didn't seem to care. You spook easy? The question was so blunt it caught me off guard. No, I said, trying to inject a confidence I didn't feel into my voice. The truth was, I spooked plenty easy. I still checked under my bed some nights, a lingering childhood habit I couldn't shake. Good, he said. The property is the old Blackwood Creek Asylum. Your job is to be a warm body. You sit, you walk around a bit. You make sure nobody who isn't supposed to be there gets in. Vandals, kids looking for a thrill, ghost chasers. You see anyone, you don't play hero. You call the sheriff. That's it. Shift is 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. Pay is $25 an hour. Cash. At the end of the week. I did the math in my head, and the number was staggering. It was more than I'd ever made. It was enough to silence Mr. Gable, restock my empty fridge, and maybe even fix the damn car. It was salvation in the form of a night watchman's gig at a haunted house. I'll take it, I said, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess them. Be at the main gate at 8:30 Monday night, Henderson said, and the line went dead. The drive out to Blackwood Creek was a descent. The familiar, cracked pavement of town gave way to a winding county road, and finally to a narrow, unpaved track that the forest seemed determined to reclaim. The trees were a dense, tangled mass of black limbs and dark needles, forming a canopy that swallowed the last of the evening light. My headlights cut a feeble tunnel through the oppressive gloom. The air grew colder, and my cell phone signal vanished bar by bar until the screen displayed a single, mocking phrase, "No service." Then, the asylum appeared. It didn't just sit on the landscape. It dominated it, a monument to misery. The main building was a sprawling Victorian Gothic nightmare of faded brick, its roof a jagged line of slate tiles and crumbling chimneys against a sky the color of a day-old bruise. Wings snaked off from the central structure like broken limbs, and hundreds of windows, most boarded, some shattered, stared out into the twilight like the vacant eyes of a corpse. A wrought iron fence, its black paint peeling to reveal angry orange rust, encircled the entire compound, its spikes like rows of jagged teeth. It was a place built to contain screams. Henderson's pickup truck was already there, parked by the massive chain gate. He was leaning against the fender, a silhouette smoking a cigarette, the cherry glowing in the dark. He was a man built for hard labor, with a barrel chest and a face that looked like it had been used to stop pucks. He didn't smile. "You're on time," he said, as if surprised. He tossed me a ring of keys that weighed as much as a brick. "This big one's for the gate. This one's for the admin building's main door. The rest you probably won't need. Don't go exploring. The place is a death trap." Asbestos in the walls, black mold thick as carpet, floors that'll drop you 2 stories if you look at them wrong. Your world is the ground floor of this front building, and the perimeter fence. That's it. He handed me a heavy, black flashlight that felt more like a weapon, and a walkie-talkie with a chipped plastic casing. "This is for me," he said, tapping the walkie. "I'm usually within a few miles. Your phone is for the sheriff, if you can get a signal by the main gate. Don't get the two confused." He led me through the gate and to the towering oak doors of the administration building. The air was instantly colder inside, thick with the holy trinity of dereliction, dust, damp, and decay. There was another scent, too, faint and cloying, like stale chemicals and old sickness. Henderson flicked a switch, and a generator outside sputtered to life with a deafening roar, illuminating a single, long hallway with a string of bare, yellow bulbs. The light didn't offer comfort. It just gave the shadows more definition. The security office was a small, glass-walled cage just inside the entrance. It contained a dented metal desk, a squeaky office chair, a bank of dead, dark gray CCTV monitors, and a coffee machine that looked like a relic from the Cold War. "There's a logbook," Henderson said, pointing to a thick, leather-bound volume on the desk. "Sign in, sign out. Note anything unusual. Not that you will." He looked at me, his eyes lingering for a moment. The last guy, he let his imagination get the better of him. Started seeing things, hearing things. Lasted 3 nights. The one before him, too. Don't be like them. It's an old building. It makes noises. Wind, rats, pipes. That's all. You get scared of a draft. You're not gonna last the week." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "And stay out of the basement. No matter what." He didn't offer any further explanation. He just walked out, the heavy oak door thudding shut behind him, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing like a coffin lid closing. I was alone. The first few hours were a study in profound boredom. The generator's drone was a constant, maddening companion. The coffee from the ancient machine was a burnt, bitter sludge, but it was hot. I flipped through the logbook. The entries from years past were mundane. All quiet. Perimeter secure. No activity. But as I got closer to the present, the entries became sparser, the handwriting more frantic. Heard scratching from Ward C again. Lights flickered in the west wing. Generator is fine. Saw a face in the window of the infirmary. Just a reflection. One entry from a few weeks back read, "The singing started again. Same song. Can't get it out of my head." The last entry, from 3 nights ago, was a single, shaky sentence. "They're not sleeping." I slammed the book shut, my heart thumping. "It's just guys trying to spook the next one," I told myself. A stupid prank. At 11 p.m., I decided a patrol was in order, if only to stretch my legs and escape the claustrophobia of the office. The main hall was a gallery of forgotten misery. Overturned gurneys lay on their sides like dead animals. Scattered papers, yellowed and brittle, carpeted the floor. I nudged one with my boot. It was a patient intake form, the ink faded but still legible. Patient exhibits extreme paranoia. Claims to hear voices from the walls. My light fell on a child's worn teddy bear. Its button eyes missing, sat propped against a wall, a silent, lonely sentinel. My flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint that hung from the walls in long strips, like sunburnt skin. I checked the doors leading to the other wings. They were all heavy, solid steel, with small, barred windows. Most were chained and padlocked. A faded sign on one read, Ward C, Intensive Treatment. Another, Pediatric Ward. A cold dread trickled down my spine. I had no idea they kept children here. I pushed on, my boots crunching on grit and fallen plaster. I found what must have been a day room. A piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed and chipped. On the walls, beneath the peeling paint, were murals. They were meant to be cheerful, smiling suns, cartoon animals, but the passage of time had twisted them into something grotesque. The suns had eyes that seemed to follow me, and the animals' smiles were manic, predatory. I backed out of the room, a new layer of unease settling over me. The night's true character revealed itself at 1:47 a.m. I was staring blankly at the wall, my mind numb from the coffee and the silence, when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound from deep within the asylum's guts. Thump, thump, thump. It was slow, deliberate, and methodical. It wasn't the random groan of settling pipes or the skittering of rats. It sounded exactly like someone bouncing a small, hard rubber ball against a distant wall. I froze, every muscle tensed. I grabbed the flashlight, its weight a small comfort, and stepped back into the hall. The air seemed colder, heavier. "Hello?" I called out. My voice was a pathetic squeak in the vast, echoing space. The thudding stopped instantly. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening, charged with a terrible awareness. I stood motionless for what felt like an hour, my ears straining. Nothing. Just the hum of the generator and the frantic beat of my own heart. I swept the flashlight beam down the long corridor, into the gaping maw of darkness beyond the last yellow bulb. The light caught nothing but dust and decay. I retreated to the office, but the illusion of safety was shattered. The building was no longer just empty, it was waiting. The second event came an hour later. I was watching the bank of dead CCTV monitors, my eyes glazed over, when one of them flickered. Not to life, not exactly. It was a surge of static, a roiling sea of black and white snow. But for a split second, an image resolved itself from the chaos. It was a room, a padded cell, and in the center of the room stood a man, his back to the camera. He was rail-thin, wearing what looked like a dirty hospital gown. He was scratching at the padded wall, his fingers digging into the material with a frantic, desperate energy. Then, as if he knew he was being watched, he stopped. He slowly turned his head, his neck seeming to rotate a full 180 degrees, an impossible, bone-cracking motion. His face was a pale, gaunt mask of agony, his eyes wide, his mouth a black, screaming hole. The monitor went dead. I fell back in my chair, a strangled cry caught in my throat. It was impossible. The system was disconnected, powered down for years. It was a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by caffeine and fear. But it had felt real. The silent scream in that man's eyes was burned into my brain. At 3:13 a.m., the walkie-talkie on the desk, the one Henderson used, crackled. I snatched it up, my hands trembling. "Henderson?" I whispered. Static hissed back at me. Then, a voice emerged from the noise, a voice that did not belong to a gruff, middle-aged man. It was a child's voice, a little girl's, singing a nursery rhyme in a high, sweet, and utterly terrifying whisper. "Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow." The voice was distorted. as if it were traveling a very long distance through water or time. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. There was a pause, filled with the sound of hissing static and something else, a wet, slick sound, like something being dragged across a concrete floor. Then the little girl's voice returned, no longer singing, but speaking in a flat, dead tone. It followed her to school one day, but it didn't want to learn. A giggle, thin and sharp as broken glass, echoed through the speaker before it fell silent. I stared at the walkie-talkie as if it were a venomous snake. That wasn't a prank. That wasn't interference. That was in the building. I'd had enough. The job wasn't worth it. No amount of money was worth this slow drip for of terror. I grabbed my keys and my phone and made for the main doors. My only thought was the feel of my car's steering wheel in my hands and the sight of the asylum shrinking in my rearview mirror. As I reached the massive oak doors, fumbling with the heavy brass lock, a new sound began. It was the slow, rhythmic, agonizing squeak of old, unoiled wheels. A wheelchair. It was coming from down the hall, from the deep, impenetrable darkness where the lights didn't reach. Squeak, roll, squeak, roll. It was moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Coming for me. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to ignore it, to get the door open and run. But my body was locked in place, my feet rooted to the floor by a primal fear I had never known. I had to see. I had to know what was pushing it. With a monumental effort of will, I turned. My flashlight beam cut a trembling path through the gloom. The wheelchair emerged from the darkness, rolling into the sickly yellow light of the last bulb. It was an old, institutional model, all rust and cracked leather. And it was empty. It rolled another 10 feet and then stopped, perfectly centered in the hallway, its wheels giving one final, mournful squeak. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was a silence that was listening. Then, from the locked and chained door of the pediatric ward, I heard it. A soft, gentle weeping. The sound of a child crying in the dark. The sound was so full of sorrow, so utterly heartbroken, that for a split second, my fear was replaced by a wave of pity. And then the weeping stopped, and the same little girl's voice that had come from the radio whispered, the sound seeming to come from right behind me. "Do you want to play with me?" I screamed. It wasn't a word, just a raw, animal sound of pure terror ripped from my lungs. I finally broke free from my paralysis, wrenched the heavy door open, and plunged into the cold night air. I didn't run. I fled. I scrambled across the weed-choked lawn, my breath tearing at my throat, my eyes fixed on the comforting, solid shape of my car. The crying from the asylum had been replaced by giggling, a cascade of high, piercing laughter that seemed to come from every shattered window at once. It followed me, chasing me across the grass. I reached my car, ripped the door open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut. I jammed the key into the ignition, my hands slick with sweat. I turned the key. Click. Nothing. The engine didn't even try to turn over. Just a dead, metallic click. I tried again. Click. And again. Click. Panic, absolute and suffocating, crushed the air from my lungs. The battery was dead, but it couldn't be. It was fine when I arrived. The giggling was right outside the car now, a chorus of unseen children, their laughter sharp and cruel. I risked a look back at the asylum. A small figure was standing in a third-floor window, one where the boards had been torn away. A little girl in a white nightdress, her face pale in the moonlight, her eyes two pools of blackness. She smiled, a grin that stretched impossibly wide, and waved a small, friendly wave. Then, the car's radio exploded into life, blasting static at a deafening volume. The headlights began to flash, on and off, illuminating the overgrown grounds in frantic, terrifying strobes. And the thudding sound returned, the sound of the bouncing ball, but it was no longer distant. It was all around me, on the roof, the doors, the hood, as if a hailstorm of invisible objects was pelting the car. I curled into a ball in the driver's seat, my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, and waited to die. The assault lasted for an eternity, or maybe only a few minutes. But as the first hint of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, a fragile line of gray against the black, the cacophony began to subside. The thudding faded, the radio fell silent, the flashing lights died. The giggling retreated, pulling back into the dark, decaying heart of the asylum. By the time the sun's first rays touched the top of the rusted fence, the world was silent again, save for the chirping of birds, who were blissfully unaware of the horrors the night had held. I stayed in my car, trembling uncontrollably, until the familiar rumble of Henderson's truck broke the morning stillness. He got out, his face impassive. He took in the scene. The main asylum door still wide open, my car parked at a frantic angle, my ghost-white face staring at him through the windshield. He didn't look surprised. He just looked weary, as if this were a scene he had played out many times before. He walked to my car, popped the hood, and reconnected the battery cable he had removed hours earlier. He didn't say a word. I got out of the car, my legs feeling like they were made of jelly. "I quit," I managed to say, my voice a hoarse croak. Henderson nodded slowly. "Yeah, I figured." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash, peeling off several $100 bills. "For your trouble," he said. It wasn't a severance package. It was hush money. As I took the cash, I had to know. "What is this place, Henderson? What really happened here?" He lit a cigarette, the smoke mingling with the morning mist. He stared at the asylum, not with fear, but with a kind of resigned familiarity. "This place was run by a man named Dr. Alistair Blackwood," he began, his voice low and gravelly. He believed that madness wasn't a disease of the mind, but a sickness of the soul. He thought he could cure it. He brought in the worst cases, the ones other institutions had written off as hopeless. The violent, the catatonic, the ones who spoke to things that weren't there. He called his method resonance therapy. He believed that if you exposed a patient to their deepest fear, over and over, you could shatter the madness and rebuild a person from the pieces. He took a long drag from his cigarette. He used sensory deprivation, electroshock, hallucinogenic drugs, anything he thought would break them. But he had a special interest in the children. He thought their minds were more pliable. He believed their souls were closer to the source of the darkness, as he called it. He built a whole wing for them. He didn't cure anyone. He just broke them. He amplified their fears, their pain, their rage, until it was all they were. The place became a pressure cooker of human misery. One night, in the winter of '68, it exploded. There was a riot. The patients, the ones he'd tortured for years, they got out. They found Blackwood in his office. What they did to him, well, the police never released the details. They shut the place down after that, but they never cleaned it out. They just locked the doors and walked away. He looked from the asylum to me, his eyes holding a deep, profound sadness. You can't just build a place like that, fill it with that much pain, and expect it to go away when you turn the key. It soaks into the walls, into the ground. It leaves an echo. What you heard tonight, what you saw, that's all there now. Just echoes of suffering, stuck on a loop, playing over and over. And they don't like being Remy. I got in my car, the engine starting on the first try, and I drove away from Blackwood Creek, the asylum shrinking in my rearview mirror until it was gone. But it never really left me. Some nights, when I'm alone in the dark, I see a little girl with a too-wide smile waving from the corner of my eye. And sometimes, very faintly, I can still hear the sound of a rubber ball, bouncing rhythmically, patiently, in the darkness. Thump, thump, thump. The money from Henderson lasted 3 months. 3 months of paying rent on time, of a full fridge, of the simple, profound luxury of not waking up with a knot of financial dread in my stomach. I got a new job, a mind-numbing gig driving a forklift in a cavernous warehouse on the other side of the county. The work was monotonous. The pay was a fraction of what Henderson had given me, but it was normal. It was sane. I surrounded myself with the mundane, hoping to bury the memories of Blackwood Creek Asylum under a mountain of cardboard boxes and inventory sheets. But the asylum wasn't the kind of place you could just leave behind. It had sunk its hooks into me, and its poison was still in my veins. Sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a recurring sideshow of horrors. I'd find myself back in that long, yellow-lit hallway, the air thick with the smell of decay. I'd see the empty wheelchair rolling towards me, its wheels squeaking a rhythm that matched my frantic heartbeat. I'd hear the thin, glassy giggle of the little girl and see her impossible two-eyed smile. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my own scream caught in my throat, the sound of a bouncing rubber ball, thump, 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 echoing in the silence of my bedroom. During the day, it was subtler, a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision that would vanish when I turned. The faint sound of a child's laughter and the hiss of static from the radio. The face of the man from the padded cell, his eyes wide with silent agony, staring back at me from my own reflection in a window. I was unraveling, a thread at a time. The catalyst for my return came in the form of a yellowed newspaper article I found online, tucked away in the digitized archives of the Crestfall Valley Chronicle. I had started obsessively researching Blackwood Creek, spending my nights falling down internet rabbit holes, searching for anything that could explain what I had experienced. Most of it was sensationalized ghost stories and amateur paranormal investigations. But this was different. It was dated November 12, 1968, just days after the riot. The official story was that the asylum had been shut down due to a violent uprising of its most dangerous patients. But this article, written by a young reporter who was probably reprimanded for his speculative tone, hinted at something else. It mentioned that Dr. Alistair Blackwood wasn't just the asylum's director. He was a known figure in occult circles. It spoke of strange symbols found painted on the walls, of rumors that his resonance therapy was less about curing madness and more about channeling it. The article quoted a local farmer who claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky over the asylum on the night of the riot. But the part that made my blood run cold was the final paragraph. It mentioned that in the chaos, several patients were unaccounted for, not escaped, unaccounted for. Among them was a 7-year-old girl named Lily, admitted for what doctors called acute night terrors and imaginary companions. The article included a small, grainy photo of her. She had dark, soulful eyes and a shy, hesitant smile. It was the girl from the window. Seeing her face, knowing her name, changed everything. She wasn't just a ghost, an echo. She was a person. A child who had been trapped in that hellhole. The thought of her, still there, still weeping in the dark, became an obsession. Henderson's words came back to me. They don't like being reminded that they're dead. Maybe that was the key. Maybe they didn't want to haunt the living. Maybe they were just crying out for someone to listen. The idea was insane, born of sleepless nights and creeping paranoia, but it took root. I had to go back. Not as a security guard, not as a victim, but as something else. I didn't know what. I just knew I couldn't run from it anymore. I went back on a moonless, overcast night a week later. I didn't call Henderson. This was my own private pilgrimage. I parked my car a half-mile down the gravel track and walked the rest of the way, a heavy backpack slung over my shoulder. It contained 2 high-powered flashlights, extra batteries, a crowbar, a digital audio recorder, and a bottle of whiskey for courage. The asylum loomed out of the darkness, even more menacing than I remembered, a black, jagged silhouette against the starless sky. The silence was absolute, the generator long dead. I circled the perimeter fence until I found a section where the rust had eaten through the base. I squeezed through, the cold, damp ground soaking the knees of my jeans. I stood before the towering oak doors of the administration building, the same doors I had fled through in terror. They were chained, but the lock was old and rusted. The crowbar made short work of it. The shriek of tortured metal echoed in the night, a sound that felt like a desecration. The doors groaned open, revealing a wall of impenetrable darkness. I took a deep breath, switched on my flashlight, and stepped inside. The air was stagnant and cold, thick with the ghosts of old smells. Without the generator's hum, the silence was a physical presence. My flashlight beam seemed small and inadequate, a tiny spear of light against an ocean of black. I walked past the glass-walled security office, a cage of memories, and down the long hall. My goal this time was not to patrol, but to explore. To go where Henderson had forbidden me to go. I started with the door marked Ward C, Intensive Treatment. The chain was thick, but the padlock was old. A few brutal strikes with the crowbar, and it shattered. The door creaked open, and a wave of foul air washed over me, a smell of sweat, fear, and old, dried blood. This was where they had kept the most severe cases. The rooms were small, claustrophobic cells, many of them padded. The walls were covered in scratches, frantic, desperate marks left by fingernails that had dug through the padding to the concrete beneath. In one cell, I found a single word scrawled over and over again in what looked like dried blood. Listen. In another, a series of crude drawings depicted stick figures being tormented by shadowy creatures with too many limbs. I switched on my audio recorder, the small red light a tiny beacon in the oppressive gloom. Is anyone here? I whispered, my voice trembling. My name is Michael. I just want to understand. The only reply was the faint, almost inaudible sound of scratching coming from the cell at the far end of the hall. Next, I went to the pediatric ward. The chain on this door was newer, thicker. It took me 10 minutes of sweating and cursing to break it. The air inside was different. It still held the scent of decay, but it was mixed with something else, a faint, cloying sweetness, like old perfume or rotting flowers. The murals on the walls of the day room were even more terrifying up close. The smiling sun had a single tear, painted in a darker shade of yellow, leaking from one eye. A cartoon rabbit's smile was a rictus of agony, its painted teeth chipped and broken. I found the children's rooms, small and bleak, each with a metal-framed bed and a small, barred window. In one room, I found a collection of small, smooth stones arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. In another, a single child's shoe lay on its side, its lace untied. I made my way to the room at the end of the hall, the one I instinctively knew was hers. Lily's room. It was colder than the others, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the walls. There were no drawings, no scratches. The room was unnervingly neat, almost sterile, except for a single object on the floor in the center of the room, a small, red rubber ball. I stared at it, my heart hammering. It was the source of the thumping sound that had haunted my nights. As I watched, the ball quivered, then rolled a few inches towards me, as if pushed by an unseen hand. I backed out of the room, my breath catching in my throat. I knew where I had to go next. The place Henderson had warned me about. The basement. The door was at the far end of the main hall, a heavy, iron-bound door with no markings. It was locked, but not with a chain. It had a heavy, industrial deadbolt. The key was still on the ring Henderson had given me, a small, ornate brass key I hadn't paid attention to before. It slid into the lock with a well-oiled click. The door swung open, revealing a set of steep, stone steps leading down into absolute blackness. A wave of cold, damp air, smelling of wet earth and ozone, rose to meet me. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I had come this far. I had to see it through. I started down, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky path before me. The basement was vast, a labyrinth of stone archways and dripping pipes. It stretched out under the entire administration building. This was the Asylum's secret heart. In one section, I found what looked like a surgical theater, complete with a rusted operating table and strange, archaic-looking medical equipment. In another, a series of small, cage-like cells, barely big enough for a person to stand in. But it was the central chamber that stopped me in my tracks. It was a large, circular room, and the floor was covered in a complex, sprawling symbol, a mix of a pentagram, astrological signs, and other, unidentifiable sigils, all painted in a dark, reddish brown that I knew wasn't paint. In the center of the symbol was a single, heavy, iron chair with leather straps at the wrists, ankles, and forehead. This was Dr. Blackwood's laboratory. This was where he had performed his resonance therapy. I saw a small, bricked-off room in the corner. The door was ajar. Inside was Blackwood's office. It was a shrine to his madness. Books on demonology and the occult lined the shelves. Patient files were stacked on a heavy oak desk. And in the center of the desk was a reel-to-reel tape recorder. I pressed the play button. The tape hissed, and then a voice filled the small room. It was Blackwood, his voice calm, clinical, and utterly devoid of empathy. Subject 47. Lily. The child presents a unique opportunity. Her connection to the other side is unusually strong. The entities she refers to as her imaginary companions are, I believe, authentic manifestations. The goal is no longer to sever this connection, but to amplify it, to use her as a conduit, a doorway. The tape continued, a horrifying record of his experiments. He would place her in the iron chair in the center of the symbol and subject her to a barrage of psychoactive drugs and auditory stimuli, all while chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The tape recorded her terrified sobs, her pleas for him to stop, and then other voices. Whispers, guttural growls, a chorus of disembodied sounds that seemed to come from the very air around the microphone. The final recording was from the night of the riot. Blackwood's voice was no longer calm. It was ecstatic, feverish. The gateway is opening. They are coming through. The resonance is magnificent. The recording was filled with the sounds of screams, of shattering glass, of the riot upstairs. But beneath it all was the sound of Blackwood, laughing, a sound of pure, triumphant madness. And then, a final sound. Lily's voice, no longer crying, but speaking in a chorus of voices, ancient and terrible. You wanted to listen, Doctor. Now you will listen. Forever. The tape ended with a sound of a wet, tearing crunch, and then silence. As the tape clicked off, the temperature in the basement plummeted. The air grew thick, heavy, and a low hum vibrated through the stone floor. The whispers started, not from the recorder, but from all around me. A cacophony of voices, the collected pain and rage of every soul that had been tortured in this place. They were swirling in the central chamber, a vortex of psychic energy coalescing around the iron chair. I could see them now, not as full apparitions, but as shimmering distortions in the air, faces of agony twisting and contorting in the darkness. And in the center of it all, I saw him, Dr. Alistair Blackwood. A tall, gaunt figure, his form made of pure shadow, his eyes burning with a cold, intelligent malice. He was bound to the chair, a prisoner of the very forces he had sought to command. But he wasn't powerless. He was the heart of the storm, the conductor of this orchestra of the damned. He turned his burning eyes on me, and I felt a pressure in my mind, a voice that was not my own, whispering promises of knowledge, of power, of an end to all my fears if I would just take a seat, if I would just listen. And then I saw her. Lily. She was standing just outside the circle, her form clearer than the others, her white nightdress glowing faintly. She wasn't smiling. Her face was a mask of infinite sadness. She looked at me, and for the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt pity. She wasn't a monster. She was a prisoner, a gatekeeper, bound to this place by Blackwood's final, failed experiment. She raised a small, translucent hand and pointed, not at me, but at the tape recorder on the desk. The message was clear. The recordings, Blackwood's voice, his ritual, they were the anchor. They were the source of the resonance that kept this place trapped in its nightmare loop. I grabbed the tape recorder and the patient files, my hand shaking. The whispers grew to a roar, the pressure in my head becoming a physical pain. Blackwood's shadowy form rose from the chair, his scream a silent, psychic shriek of rage. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, back up the stone steps, through the main hall, and out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. I threw the files and the recorder in the back, and I drove, my tires spinning on the gravel, not looking back. I drove for an hour until I found a deserted clearing. I built a small fire and, one by one, I fed it the relics of Blackwood Creek. I watched as the patient files, filled with so much pain, curled into black ash. And then, I threw the tape recorder onto the flames. The plastic casing melted, the reels warped, and for a moment, I thought I heard a final, collective sigh rise up with the smoke, a long, shuddering exhalation of release. I drove home as the sun was rising, feeling empty. The fear was gone, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The asylum is still out there, a crumbling monument to a madman's ambition. But it's quieter now. The echoes have faded. I don't have the nightmares anymore. The house is silent. But I know that what I did wasn't an ending. It was a transference. I listened. I took a piece of their pain, of their story, into myself. And I know, with a certainty that chills me to my soul, that I will carry it with me, a silent, watchful passenger, for the rest of my life.